Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. The first story in today's video dives straight into a family nightmare, a legal, emotional, and downright vicious battle over a grandfather's ashes. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. The fight for my grandparents' ashes. I'm 18, and for the last 2 months, I've been living in a nightmare I never expected. An explosive family war over my grandfather's ashes. Legally, the ashes belong to me. My grandmother made me her executor, her sole inheritor, and her decision was intentional. She trusted me to honor her and my grandfather's wishes. She inherited everything from him, which means I inherited everything after her. There's no legal gray area, no maybe, just fact. But my uncle and brothers suddenly decided that they get to rewrite both the law and my grandparents' wishes. My grandfather wasn't biologically related to me, yet he raised me. My uncle, on the other hand, wasn't biologically related to either of them and barely had a relationship with them, but that didn't stop him from barging in after my grandmother died, demanding that the ashes be buried immediately. Never mind the fact that both my grandparents explicitly said they wanted to be kept together and wanted me to decide what happened to their remains. When I refused to do what he wanted, he started throwing around threats about lawyers. I contacted my grandmother's attorney, who confirmed exactly what I already knew. I am the only person with any legal authority over the ashes. Then my brother joined the circus. Out of nowhere, he started repeating my uncle's threats, claiming he was going to take the ashes and bury them himself. He told me some story about a handwritten will my grandfather supposedly made, which wouldn't even be legally valid. He said he'd get a lawyer too. He was furious that I wouldn't hand the ashes over, but the truth is simple. He didn't have the relationship with my grandparents that I did. Neither did my uncle. Both of them suddenly found deep concern for honoring the dead only when they realized they could control something. My plan has always been the same. My grandparents wanted their ashes together, and they'll be buried together when I die. Because that's what they asked me to do. Until then, they're safe with me. Anyone who wants to visit them can. If someone wants a public memorial spot, they can dedicate a bench, but their remains stay with me. Because of how intense the threats got, I contacted the police to ask how I could prevent someone from trying to take the ashes. They told me they would call me back. While waiting, I laid out the whole history for myself. My uncle didn't bother speaking to anyone for years until 6 months before my grandmother died. Suddenly he cared, but not about her. My brother, same story. This isn't about love or grief, it's about control. And things got worse. The police finally called me back, and the officer explained that ashes are legally considered property. They don't touch property disputes. That was stressful enough. But then my father got involved. He asked to hold on to the ashes temporarily, claiming it was just until things calmed down. Instead, he refused to return them. He used a tone I've known my whole life, the kind meant to intimidate. It scared me enough that I called the police again and asked an officer to come see the threatening messages he sent. Instead, the officer called him directly, which gave him an opening to twist the story the way he always does. My father's threatened to put me in a mental institution before, despite the fact that I don't live with him. I'm an adult, and I have an adult protective worker. None of his threats are real, but they're meant to keep me scared and compliant. Not anymore. Once I get the ashes back, I'm going low contact with every single person who tried to take them from me. My grandparents trusted me because I'm the only person in this family who actually honored their wishes. And after everything that's happened, I understand exactly why. Update. A week later, everything finally broke open. My father refused, again, to return the ashes, so I contacted the attorney and asked what my next step should be. He didn't hesitate. File a civil theft report because ashes are property. Taking them without permission is literally theft. So I did. The police contacted my father, but this time it wasn't a polite phone call. An officer came to his house with the report in hand. The moment they explained that refusing to return property was a criminal matter, suddenly he wasn't so tough anymore. He handed the ashes back immediately to avoid charges. My uncle doubled down and sent me several threatening messages about how I stole his father and how he'd make sure a judge forced me to hand them over. Every message he sent went straight to the attorney. Every message became evidence. A restraining order was granted within the week. Then the funniest part happened. My uncle tried to file something with the court claiming he should be given the ashes. The judge dismissed it on the spot, told him he had no legal standing, and warned him that continuing to file harassment-level petitions could get him sanctioned. Once my brother realized the police and courts were involved, he backed off so fast he practically evaporated from the family group chat. Now my grandparents' ashes are back with me, safe. Everyone who threatened me has either been legally shut down or scared into silence, and for the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe. I honored my grandparents' wishes. The people who tried to control me failed, and I'm finally free to live my life without them. This whole situation shows exactly what happens when people suddenly care about family legacy only when there's something they think they can control. Your uncle and brother weren't motivated by love or respect. They were motivated by the idea of having power over a decision your grandparents never entrusted to them. And our next story. The Amazon Karen and how she ended up moving out. I've been living in my house for 3 years, and the place has always been quiet. My neighbor and I never became friends, but we exchanged polite hellos when bringing in groceries or mowing the lawn. Nothing warm, nothing hostile, just the usual suburban neutrality. Our houses look nearly identical, and apparently Amazon can't tell them apart because every so often a package meant for me ends up on her doorstep. Most deliveries arrive correctly, but roughly 10% drift next door like lost pigeons. Usually the neighbor would bring the package and drop it at my door without ringing, without comment, and without any real acknowledgement beyond a grim expression. Twice when expensive items were misdelivered, I walked over to her porch myself and retrieved them. The name and address were clearly mine, and I rang the bell both times out of courtesy. She never answered. She never objected. She never said a single word about it, so I could only assume this unspoken, mildly inconvenient system worked for both of us. Yesterday, Amazon marked the delivery as completed, but the box wasn't on my porch. One glance at my ring cam confirmed it had landed next door. Since she usually brought my packages over within a day, I waited 24 hours, nothing. This morning, checked again, and the box was still sitting on her porch with my full name and address printed on the label. I walked over, stepped onto the doormat, not past it, picked up my own package, and went home. It took 10 seconds. 2 hours later, without knocking or saying a word, she dropped a note into my mailbox. The handwriting alone told me the tone before I even opened it. "Don't you ever effing go on my property to get misaddressed deliveries or I'll have you arrested. I have cameras." That was it. A neighbor who had quietly handed off my packages for years suddenly turned into a snarling Karen over me retrieving something that belonged to me. Never mind that she'd used my doorstep as a drop-off spot plenty of times, or that Amazon was the one misdelivering, not me. It was like she'd been waiting for an excuse to explode. I didn't respond. I didn't confront her. I just contacted Amazon, documented everything, and asked them to flag the address mix-up so it wouldn't keep happening. But apparently I wasn't the only one she'd been directing her hostility toward. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing stories from neighbors, how she screamed at delivery drivers for using her pavement, how she accused the retired couple next door of stealing her mail, and how she nearly called the police on a teenager for turning around in her driveway. One woman said Karen had reported her dog to animal control 3 times because it looked rude. The dog is a blind, elderly beagle. I ignored the drama until the day a city code enforcement truck pulled onto our street and parked directly in front of Karen's house. An officer spent almost 30 minutes taking photos of her yard, her broken shutters, the peeling paint on her siding, and the mountain of cardboard she'd been hoarding behind her recycling bin. Apparently, every time she filed a complaint about someone else's property, and she filed many, it triggered her routine look at her own. And she had violations. Lots of them. Within a week, she received several citations, improper disposal of waste, failure to maintain her structure, and a warning about blocking her driveway with junk. I only knew because she stood in the middle of her driveway screaming into her phone about how this entire neighborhood is conspiring against her. Then came the final blow. Amazon misdelivered one last package, but this time they left it with a neighbor across the street. Karen, apparently watching from her window like a hawk, waiting for prey, marched over there and began yelling at them for harassing her and stealing her things. The neighbor calmly told her the package wasn't hers and tried to hand it to me instead. Karen escalated, got in their face, and threatened to call the police. The neighbor's husband recorded the entire exchange. The police came, and this time they weren't sympathetic. Between the false accusations, the threatening note she'd left me, the hostile confrontations with multiple neighbors, and her growing code violations, the officers made it very clear she was on thin ice. When she kept shouting over them, they cuffed her for disorderly conduct and escorted her into the patrol car while half the street watched through their curtains. She was given fines, mandatory community service, and a court-ordered evaluation after several residents submitted statements about her erratic behavior. 3 months later, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. She just packed up her junk, peeled out of the street, and disappeared. She'd been edging toward this outcome for a long time, snapping at delivery drivers, accusing people without proof, filing complaints that went nowhere. Taking her package wasn't the spark. It was simply the first time you were close enough to witness the instability up front. And our next story. Generations of neighbors used our land and destroyed our fence. We ended it with concrete, flowers, and the sound of scraping metal. My family's lived in this tiny private neighborhood for generations, long before any of us were even born. Almost everyone nearby is some kind of distant relative, which sounds wholesome until you realize every single one of them is completely out of their minds. These people have been fighting over fences, hedges, chickens, and gravel since the 1970s. My brother and I grew up hearing arguments echo across the yards like it was the town soundtrack. Our property line is shaped like a square, and it borders the road on two sides. One particular corner of the road had always been a tight squeeze, so decades ago my parents allowed the neighbors to use about 1 square meter of our land just so they could take the turn without scraping their cars. It was a small gesture of goodwill. Emphasis on was. That tiny patch of land would eventually start a war. The road itself was gravel. Not fancy, not smooth, just functional. Over the years, my parents were always the ones filling potholes, spreading fresh gravel, and keeping the road somewhat usable. The neighbors, they never lifted a finger. But because my parents maintained 90% of the road for decades, everyone decided that, naturally, it should be my parents' responsibility to pay the full cost of paving the entire road with asphalt. They repeated this nonsense so many times they convinced themselves it was rational. Fast forward 20 years, the road's still gravel, no one wants to pay for pavement, and the neighbors have only gotten more entitled. Then one morning, a massive delivery truck carrying several tons of firewood rolled up to the neighbor directly across from us. And of course, because none of these people understand spatial awareness, the truck driver tried to squeeze into a space that didn't exist. The crash echoed through our kitchen window. By the time my father and I got outside, the truck had completely crushed a section of our living fence. The bushes, the saplings, and part of our metal fence were mangled underneath the tires. The driver shrugged and said, "Didn't see it." The neighbors refused to pay a cent for the damages. They even claimed we should have moved the fence because it was too close to where the road curves. My father just stared at them, stunned. He told me later that this wasn't even the first time. Apparently it was the third. 3 times trucks belonging to neighbors or their contractors had destroyed our fence, and each time they refused to take responsibility. That was the moment my father snapped. My dad's been a police officer for decades. He knows the law inside and out, and if there's one thing our neighbors underestimate, it's how patient he can be when he's planning something. He went into the shed, grabbed a shovel, and dug up the original metal property marker that had sunk into the ground. That marker showed precisely where our land ended and exactly where that shared corner actually belonged. Then he dragged out large plastic barrels and filled them with rocks. He lined them perfectly along our property line, right where the neighbors liked to cut the corner of the road. He didn't block the road, he simply protected the land they'd been using for free. 6 hours later, chaos erupted. 3 neighbors hit the barrels in the span of a single afternoon, hard. Each one stormed up to our front door, shouting about hazards and unfair obstructions and threatening to call the cops. But funnily enough, none of them ever actually made the call. They all knew that tiny piece of land was still legally ours, and that the property marker proved they'd been driving over our land for decades without permission. One neighbor, a guy named Anton, got in my dad's face and said, "I'll come back here tonight and F up whatever you build next." My dad just smiled, the kind of smile that means, "I'm not worried. You should be." Over the next year, the barrels took an absolute beating. Cars hit them so often they dented, cracked, and eventually became useless. Every few months we'd replace them. Every few months the neighbors ran them again. It was a war of attrition, and they were too proud and too stupid to stop accelerating directly into a visible object. My father finally said, "Enough petty revenge, time for something permanent." One quiet Saturday afternoon, he and I mixed cement, carried wood planks, and set up molds along the edge of our land. We laid a thick, solid concrete border exactly along the property line. No more barrels, no more excuses, and definitely no way to drive over it. When the cement dried, we even planted a row of bright orange flowers on top. My father wiped his hands and said, "If they want to hit something now, at least they'll have something pretty to look at." It didn't take long. Within 2 weeks, 5 different neighbors scraped, dented, or outright destroyed parts of their cars on the new cement barrier. Not a single one knocked on our door. Not a single one complained. They all knew the truth. The free ride was over. Some tried to drive extra wide around the corner and ended up driving through their own yard instead. Others slowed to a crawl, glaring angrily at the flowers. From that day on, our fence was never destroyed again. Our property line was never crossed, and the neighbors, they finally learned, painfully, that generosity doesn't mean ownership. And when you abuse someone's goodwill for 20 years, eventually they build something you can't knock down. Literally. There's something incredible about how people will fight harder to preserve a privilege they were never owed than to take care of something themselves. These neighbors had decades to maintain their own road, or at least respect your land, and instead they treated your property like communal space. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.